coming session that we have is called Animal Matters, Observing Behavior. So how do we humans interact with animals? Now, these animals could be pets, they could be domesticated, they could also have turned feral, or they might have just adapted to this particular environment that we have right now. So how do we, as humans, interact with animals in this concrete jungle, in urban spaces and cities? So today we have Anindita Bhadra, who is a professor at IISER Kolkata, and Deepa Padmanabhan, author of Invisible Housemates, in conversation with Somdatta Karak, who is the head of science communication at CCMB and also happens to be one of the curators of the Science and City stream at HLF. So let me welcome the moderator and the speakers for this discussion on this rather complex relationship that we as humans share with animals, and especially in an environment like this around us. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining for this conversation, and welcome Anindita and Deepa. So I must tell you that the first time Anindita caught my attention was because she is really the dog expert in the country. And I'm trained as a biologist. I've spent a lot of my time around biologists, and all of them, almost all of them, work on model organisms. These are animals, be it small little insects or worms or rodents that are raised in laboratories. There are few that I know who work on fields and possibly like primates. But then Anindita's work pops up, and she works on stray dogs, not dogs bred in labs. So Anindita, why don't we right away start understanding why did you think of working on stray dogs when everybody else around you possibly was working on model organisms?
Yeah, so at the end of my PhD in IISc, where I was working on WASP politics, I was wondering what to do next, and I had a little baby boy, and I didn't want to go abroad for a postdoc, the normal course. And in conversation with my supervisor, Professor Gadakkar, I decided to come up with a research proposal of my own to apply to places. And I had been reading a lot of dog research at that time. Dog research was really picking up. And I happened to ask, why is everybody studying pet dogs in households or bringing them to the labs and not studying dogs on the streets who are in a more natural environment? And my supervisor had told me because, you're following research done in the global north and they don't have stray dogs, as we call them, on the streets. And it struck me that to understand the evolution of the relationship between dogs and humans, you really have to study these animals which are out there. They're freely breeding in nature, they face the struggle for existence, they're interacting with humans, but they're not pets, they have all the pressures of survival like any other animal you would study in the forest. So that's how I came up with this idea that I want to study them in their natural habitat, not bringing them in the lab, but going out to where they are, just like somebody would study elephants in the forest. So for me, the dogs are in the urban jungle.
Correct. But then there's a reason why people study model organisms, and that's because a body of knowledge gets built around that one specific organism and people extend it to other life forms. Then when you start working on this novel organism, no, not novel because they're rare, but because nobody has worked on it. And you also brought up that global north doesn't work on them because they don't have stray dogs. So it's a very singular, very secluding affair, no?
Absolutely,
in that sense.
Absolutely. In fact, when we first started sending out papers for review, we got back review comments like, dogs don't live on streets. This is not the natural environment for dogs. Or how can you do an experiment giving biscuits to dogs? Dogs don't eat biscuits. And these were not scientific comments, and we were getting angry, but then we realized that we have to really educate the world. And it was very slow. Of course, our papers went out to people who worked on dogs, but they didn't know dogs on the streets. So initially, publications took a long time, and I was really struggling to get papers through. But then some people noticed that this is interesting work, and eventually, now I'm very happy to say that 16 years after I started, now there are actually labs in the global north who are going to countries in the global south to study what we call free-ranging dogs, following on our footsteps. Only they have to spend money for all the international travel. We don't have to. So we can do a small budget research. But then people are saying, oh, this is fantastic. This is the model system for understanding dogs. At least this started, at least 6 to 7 years after we started. So yeah, it was isolating, but no longer.
Thank you so much for setting that premise. And I will come back to understanding more of your work, but I'll now want to understand Deepa a little better. Deepa has been a journalist, has been writing about biodiversity, lots of facets of nature, and she has now written this book which is called Invisible Housemates and talks about all kinds of things that are not cats and dogs, and rather things that we all consider as pests, be it cockroaches, be it pigeons, be it mosquitoes, and the 13 such organisms in that book. So Deepa, please tell us why, what fascinated you about these pests? Why do you want to tell us about them?
Thanks, Somnath. So as you said, I'm an independent freelance journalist, and I've been writing a lot on wildlife conservation and biodiversity. Everybody is curious about wildlife. We go on safaris to see wildlife. Somewhere along the way, it just got me thinking that we don't pay attention to, the small insects and birds and animals that live in and around us. And that's why it is called invisible housemates, not because they're invisible, but we don't want them to be visible. We don't want them in our house. Like you said, we categorize them as pests. But each of them has a role to play in our ecosystem, right? Many of them were there here before us. And we have, in a sense, occupied their space. So I just wanted to throw light on these creatures, and idea was to maybe change the perception of people, to view them not so much as pests, but as important players in the ecosystem.
So tell us then a little bit more, enlighten us on how not to look at them as pests and otherwise.
So I'll give the example of a cockroach, which I found most fascinating when I was writing and doing the research for the book. Because first, I used to despise cockroaches. The moment I see one in my house, like, it had to be exterminated. But when I started researching, I found it so fascinating to just, maybe give us some examples which will intrigue the audience. So one thing that fascinated me was that, cockroaches, they release this chemical odor by which they all recognize each other. And the cockroaches, they differentiate between their siblings and non-siblings, and they change their behavior accordingly. So they don't mate with their siblings, which I thought, like, wow, they have, like, good moral character. And they are very similar to us human beings in the sense they are social organisms. They live in a colony. And scientists found that if you isolate one of the cockroaches and, keep them separately, they show kind of signs of depression. They don't groom themselves. They're not interested in eating. They're not interested in finding a mate. So they're quite similar to us in that way. And there are many other interesting features, which is there in my book. So after I read that, and I wrote about it, I said, okay, and of course they play a role in an ecosystem, right? They are scavengers. Even when, they, in the soil, they dig the soil and they cause, aeration of the soil. So they have a role to play. So since then, yes, if I see a cockroach, I don't kill them, but, I still don't want them in my house. So I just, pick them up and put them outside in the garden. And similarly with rats, right? We all don't want rats around us, but they also have a similar role to play when, they aerate the soil. And there are also some very cool facts about rats. You can read them in my book. Like one thing was that I found that they actually have, scientists have found that they have empathy for their fellow rats, which I think is kind of, in humans, it's kind of that value of empathy is going down, but here you have rats, which most people despise, but they still have this empathy and they help each other. There is an experiment that I've talked about in my book, which was quite fascinating.
Thank you so much. So it's very interesting how we describe animal behavior in words that probably make sense to humans, right? Like empathy, depression, happiness, kinship. I'm sure it comes up in your work every day, right? I mean, can you run us through how you do these experiments? I mean, I would also like to understand from you how you made sense of all the research out there, but let's hear from the field scientists first.
So all our work is done on the streets. We have some experiments or ongoing projects in which we have to observe groups of dogs over long periods of time, a whole year, where a student is following several groups, where we identify individuals by their coat colors. So often people tell us, how do you know they all look the same? But they don't. Even in the same pack, each dog has its own morphologically different features. And we name them based on their gender and coat color, so we don't have, human names for them, but coats. And then we have what every behavioral biologist starts with, a list of behaviors called an ethogram, and we follow them like any other behavioral study. But then I think what people find more fascinating is where we do choice test-like experiments, where we give them options and we wait for them to make a choice, and based on this, we arrive at conclusions. So often, we get a lot of interesting observations where in the population, when you approach a dog and put bowls of food in front of them, we have a question in mind and we have an experiment design. Some dogs will just look at you and go away, they're not interested. Some dogs will come wagging their tail, they're not interested in the food, they're interested in you, they want to come and paw you, though they're completely unfamiliar. And what we have learned is there are always some overeager dogs, there are some very reluctant, very anxious dogs, and this is a nice distribution in the population. And
So plainly put, it's okay to use these human adjectives to describe dogs.
we do, in the sense that even in behavioral biology, we do have terminologies like kinship, because there's a whole kin selection theory. But then we usually don't use words like empathy, because we don't know what empathy for them is. But we look at markers like tail wagging as a friendly gesture, so we can call them friendly. But we define by very strict behavioral criteria and give them scores, saying, okay, what is the score on anxious to friendly scale? And then we score them. So that is how we objectify our observations, so that we don't have our own. Now, often, somebody who's performing the experiment and somebody who's decoding the video are two different people, so that, their own biases during the experiment doesn't come into the decoding. So we try to keep all of these methodological, formalities very strict, because, I think when I work with students, everybody who works in my lab like dogs. That's why they're there. If you're scared of dogs, they'll not come there. So my students go through this training to unlearn and, to now start looking at their focal animals as, as an observer rather than as a dog lover, which takes a lot of time. And it's very difficult with dogs because, they're not in a cage, they're not on a leash. For pet dogs, people do experiments on a leash, but here they're not on a leash. And they don't understand your instructions. So you have to work around them and not upset them in some ways. So it takes some learning, but yeah, it's possible.
And Deepa, I mean, as a journalist, how did you make sense of all these papers out there? I mean, was it complicated, or is it's straightforward to make sense of these behaviors?
Yeah, so some of them were easy to understand. Some,
What made them easy?
in the sense, I mean, if the experiment was, simple, and the observations, rather the conclusions were, easy to understand. And I chose such experiments which would kind of, so that the reader could kind of relate to it and make sense to it, make sense of them. So like, and you asked the question about using these terms. So, I mean, like I said, empathy, that was not a term that the scientists have used in their paper, but I have, used that in my book because I thought that's how the reader would make sense of it. So, that's how they would understand, the experiment in a better way. So yeah, that was not a term that a scientist would use. And
So can you run us through some of the experiments that really caught your attention, that has left an impression on your mind? It's on.
so I mean, there are many.
I think you just need to hold close. proposal?
Okay. There are many experiments that caught my attention, and there was one, well, I won't say it was since you're talking about experiment, okay. So let me talk about this one experiment that was done on crows. So there was, I forgot which university it was, but they were studying the crows in the campus. And what they did was they assigned the researchers, one set of researchers wore like a scary mask. And they went out and they caught the crows in the campus. And then there were another set of researchers who did not wear any scary mask. And after the crows were captured, they were then released back. And these researchers, again, they wore that scary mask and went out into the campus. And the crows started cawing at them, and literally it is like as if they are like shouting at them and scolding them. And after a few weeks, when they again wore the mask and they went out, what they found was that even the other crows whom they had not captured also started cawing at them and started shouting at them. And within a few years, it was even the birds that had come in from other, had migrated to that place, even they were shouting at them. So there was a kind of a learning that probably the original crows had transmitted to the other crows, saying that, this mask is a dangerous mask because they have captured us, so beware of them. So every time these birds saw that scary looking mask, they were like, it was like a caution for them, yeah, okay, this is a dangerous person, and, so they would start scolding them. So I thought that was a very cool experiment, how that even the new birds were able to recognize, and though they had never seen that mask before, that they knew that this was a dangerous mask and they had to stay away.
Absolutely. So Anindita, what kind of a question are you addressing these days? What do you find? And especially the entire country is discussing dogs right now. So
Yes.
everybody wants to understand dogs better, but almost all of us look at dogs either from an angle of compassion or fear. Only few people like you have the very objective angle of science to help make sense of this. So how are you making sense of all this?
Several of our ongoing projects are about understanding how dogs perceive humans, how they recognize humans. So, if you're familiar to a dog, so we've got this, the mask reminded me, we have this series of experiments which a student was conducting. He would wear sunglasses, a hoodie, a mask. So we started during COVID because we thought, everybody is wearing masks. Are the dogs still able to recognize us? And that is how it started. And now we see that dogs are really looking at our eyes. Those are very important for them to, identify familiar versus unfamiliar. We have also seen that our voices matter. So when a familiar person calls, that is something that the dog recognizes a lot. And we did this using a human versus a robot, which has the similar build and size and wearing the same clothes as the person. And the robot calls and the person does not. The dogs go to the robot, not to the human, who's familiar to them. So we are doing these many experiments to basically try to understand how dogs...
Smell? We always thought
We
smell.
always thought smell too, but it looks like smell is something they're using only at very close contact. Once they recognize you, they'll approach. Then they'll come and sniff your hands and your feet. And it makes sense because these dogs are in a very olfactorily noisy environment, right? There's so many smells around. So from a distance, it's not smell. It looks like visual and vocal, then smell at close contact. It's also the same when it comes to food. So from a distance, they seem to approach by seeing that there is food. And here, a set of experiments have shown that dogs give a lot of importance to the color yellow. They seem to absolutely, zero in on anything which looks yellow, which was very unexpected for us because nobody has ever said dogs have a favorite color. But we have seen that they'll even ignore food when they see something yellow. They'll first go explore the yellow stuff. So there's a lot of visual cues out there, and in the urban habitat, I think that is adaptive. So in the context of all this debate, people keep saying dogs will attack, dogs will do this. So it's the body language that they're looking at. That is very obvious. If you are crouching, they'll avoid you, or they might bark at you. Or if you're pretending to pick up a stone, they'll try to run away. If you hold a stick towards them, they'll try to go away. So they are observing us. All our experiments are showing this. They're definitely observing us. They are paying a lot of attention to our body language, then our eyes. We have even found that when the dogs come and beg, these puppy eyes look that they make at you, they are more prone to begging from a person who is eating or has food and is looking at them versus somebody who has food but is not making eye contact. So human eyes are very important for them, but if you gaze at them for too long, they don't like it. Another set of experiments show us they look away, they look at you like this, look away, and then move away. What's this guy doing looking at me? Maybe it's going to come. And other animals we know, they don't like direct gazing. So they look at your eyes, and studies on pets tell us that dogs have hijacked the oxytocin pathway, which is the maternal hormone or love hormone. So from pets, we know that when humans and dogs look at each other, we both release oxytocin, which makes us like dogs and dogs like us, similar to our response to human babies. But these dogs are looking at our eyes, they are paying attention to our body language and our gestures, and making instantaneous decisions about people. And very rarely will they attack. At most, they'll growl and bark from a distance, and only then, when they feel threatened themselves, then they'll attack. And we actually know that, from data also, lactating females who are guarding babies or ill dogs are more prone to attack. So this entire thing about all dogs out there out there to bite people is very, very wrong.
So then, if you have to summarize and tell people, give suggestions on how to have a healthy relationship with dogs, what would that be?
Pet them, feed them. In fact, we have seen that they actually like people who pet them. And they trust you if you are petting them more than if you are just giving them food. And makes a lot of sense because people feed them poisonous food all the time. But people who pet them will never hurt them, That's something given. So if a dog does not like to be approached, let it be. That's the first thing. Second is, if a dog comes towards you, pet it on the head. That is the first place where you can make contact.
Like, can I really just go to a stray dog and pet it on its head? Like, it's so near to its mouth, it will bite. No?
I do it all the time. I've never been bitten. My son has grown up doing this since he was 2 years old. He's never been bitten.
Okay, all right. Deepa, do you want to add anything to this? No. Okay.
But yeah, thing is, from the body language, you'll know if the dog wants to be petted. If the dog kind of moves away, then approaching it to pet is risky. And then, of course, food. But then, this entire debate about feeding. And I think we have, as humans, created this problem by overfeeding dogs. We have to remember dogs are scavengers. They're not used to 3 meals a day. They're not used to eating in bulk every day. They go by the feast and famine behavior where they'll eat a lot on one day if they are getting garbage outside a shadi. But next 2 days they might not eat. And that's completely fine with them. And they are absolutely carnivores. They have genes which have enabled them to digest carbs. That doesn't mean we feed them khichdi every day. That is not their diet. So overfeeding a lot of carbs means a lot of energy which they have to then, burn. And forgetting that dogs are group living animals who have territories. They are highly territorial. Giving a lot of dogs food in one place, all of these actually create issues.
So like I remember once upon a time I lived in a place where I used to reach home quite late in the night and the dog mafias would be out there. Yeah. And
Yep.
like just to cross that street would feel like I'm like treading my life there. So, can we do anything about it? Is it
Yeah,
the dog
bribe them
fault?
with some Parle-G.
Okay, so it's just sugar rush that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
They love you then.
No, but then at the same time, now if I put at it as the animal rights point of view, and health is a part of that right, I keep seeing these very, very obese dogs also. And obese by my definition of understanding obesity.
Too much carbs.
Yeah, and so, what is it that we are doing with dogs? We have a very primal relationship
I
with
think
them.
we have forgotten our old traditional practice of giving leftovers after meals to scavengers. No, not just dogs, right? Dogs, crows, mynas, cats, everybody would come and eat those leftovers which we dropped outside in the courtyard or someplace in one corner. Now we have clean streets, garbage pickers, everything. So this tradition has been forgotten. So every dog would have 3-4 households in the neighborhood where it would go around scavenging. Somebody would give him an extra biscuit or it, and that would be fine. And then when it would be hungry, it will go kill a rat or two and eat a frog or two. That would be fine. Now dogs don't hunt. Dogs don't kill these animals which were its usual prey. They get fed with a lot of khichdi or rice boiled with a bit of chicken maybe. And now people tell me very happily that they are giving vegan food to dogs on streets. I don't know why. Or vegetarian food to dogs on streets, but that's not supposed to be their food. The other thing is, we happily say that, oh, we are taking care of all the dogs in the neighborhood because we have neutered them and now there are not going to be problems. Who gives us the right to play God? First, you overfeed them, you vaccinate them, and you take care of all their puppies and make them all survive, whereas naturally only 20% would survive, 1 in 5 pups. And then you say there are too many dogs, now we go neuter them, and then we overfeed them and make them obese, and then when they need to burn their energy, they go fight with each other because there are too many dogs, and then we say, okay, now we have to do something about these dogs, put them in shelters. So it's a human-created problem. I grew up seeing dogs in the neighborhood, playing with them. There were 4 or 5. Now in the same neighborhood, there are 15 dogs because there is one feeder who feeds every dog that comes there a lot of rice and khichdi, and the dogs don't move. There are just too many for that small neighborhood. That is the issue.
Yeah. And one thing that I always notice is that something about humans, right? Like we always go to extremes, it seems like. We love a lot, we hate a lot.
Either we are extreme dog lovers or we are extreme dog haters.
No, not just in sense of dogs,
Yeah.
but also coming
Everything,
to Deepa's
right?
research topics.
Not even one cockroach in the house.
Yeah. So yeah, should I allow cockroaches in the house?
I think it's a personal thing because cockroaches actually are not harmful. They don't spread diseases like mosquitoes or rats. We have developed this stigma against cockroaches because we view them as dirty. I mean, they are seen in the garbage and in the sewage. So we think that they are dirty, and there's a feeling of disgust. So I don't think that they are not harmful, but it's a personal thing. You think that maybe having a cockroach in a house is dirty or it's maybe not hygienic. I mean, I personally don't like having a cockroach, but then, if they're in the garden, I don't mind, yeah.
Same with lizards, right? People don't like having lizards, but they actually do a lot of service to us.
Yeah. So lizards, they take care of, the mosquitoes and the other insects. So they do act as pest control mechanisms in their own way. So I don't mind having lizards in my house. They are there.
Something I'll just mention. Often when I do outreach talks, I tell students that, okay, you live in a city, and, where do you think you need to go to watch nature? Or, observe animals? And they will tell me, forests, even deserts, they'll tell me. And then I say, okay, fine, don't you have nature around you? Then somebody will say, yeah, trees. And then I'll say, okay, animals. No. Then somebody will say, okay, yeah, dogs and cats, but nothing else. And then I actually show them pictures, lizards, cockroaches, ants, and they'll say, oh yes, they're all there. So, when I first heard about your book, this is what I thought, that they're really invisible to most people, right?
So,
Yeah, Abhi, I just wanted to add, since you talked about who are we to play God. So there are some of the themes in my book, if I may just talk about that, how we humans, we think that we are very intelligent people, and we try to control and manipulate the population of other animals and insects around us. But actually we are quite clueless, and most of the time I think we are just bungling. So like one example I'll give you from my book is about sparrows. From in 15th and 16th century, a lot of Europe considered sparrows as pests because they were feeding on the crops and destroying the crops. And there was a concentrated movement to get rid of sparrows. Similarly, in 1958, in China, again, Chairman Mao, he decreed that sparrows are pests and they should be exterminated. And thousands of sparrows were killed. And then what happened? They found that actually the crops were getting destroyed even more because of the worms and the crop pests, which the sparrows were actually feeding on. And then that, along with other factors, caused the Great Famine of China. And then they realized that they're wrongdoing, and they said, okay, we need to bring the sparrows back. And this theme is there. If you read my book, you'll see it is there in almost every animal or insect, right? We first introduce them somewhere, and then we try to feed them, and then they then become too much. Then we call them as pests, and then we try to control them. It's the same case with pigeons now. So we think that we know what we are doing, but most of the time we are just bungling along, and then it's the animals and the insects who are suffering at the end of it, because we think that, okay, now they are pests and we should get rid of them.
No,
Yeah,
absolutely.
basically, I think people just look at species in isolation, but what they need to understand, it's an ecosystem. Even in urban habitats, it's a very highly connected ecosystem. You cannot just look at animals in isolation.
Yeah. So, no, I'll come to that. So, I was actually quite surprised when I saw sparrows being featured in your list of book, which, to me, sparrows, I come from a circumstance where sparrows are these desired rare entities, right? There are special drives to support sparrows against pigeons, for example, in our gated communities. And then you spoke about sparrows, and this one line in your book really struck hard with me, that when you see something too much, it's a pest. When it's too little, then you really crave for it.
Yeah.
So,
If I can say the line because I
Yeah.
remember it, and it struck me also a lot. So it was written by a biologist called Rob Dunn, and he said, when sparrows are rare, we tend to like them. When they are common, we tend to hate them. Our fondness is fickle and predictable, but it says more about us than them.
yeah.
And
Absolutely.
that's it encapsulates our interaction with, I think, all animals and species around us.
So now I will come to this. I'll try to understand what should be our interaction then with all these life forms around us. On one hand, you said that go pet a dog. It will have a healthy relationship with you. And then I tried to, I'm also sensing that, oh, let them just be. So what is this?
Let them be.
Let them, but then what
That is my philosophy, let them be. Don't interfere in their lives as much as you can. That's the healthiest way to be. Just coexist.
And Deepa, did you find any evidence for this let them be philosophy in your research?
So I think yes, but I'm not sure right now. I think we are past that tipping point. Yes, let them be would be the philosophy if we are in ideal conditions. If the ecosystem was in balance, right? Then yes, then we don't interfere and nature will take care of itself. But right now we have already interfered so much that I don't know if let it be
Yeah.
will work now. But it's a very difficult and I think a nuanced question.
And how do you make sense of that nuance then?
So, for example, now pigeons, right? I've talked about how pigeons were once prized possessions, right? A lot of royals and elite used to have them and breed them because they were used as messenger pigeons, and then with technology, we did not have any use for the pigeons, and then they were let loose, and now we have feral pigeons all over the world. And many cities are trying to tackle this problem because now pigeons are known to cause this lung disease. So how do we tackle that? It's with dogs at least people are saying, okay, you neuter them and all of that, which again I don't know. Pigeons are in the sky. How do you control them? Right, and today on the way, when I was here, there was somebody with me who lives in Bombay, and she was telling me that she works as a wildlife rescuer, urban wildlife rescue. And she's been getting a lot of calls to rescue pigeons because now people have started putting these bird nets. And the pigeons are getting stuck in them and, so they're getting a lot of calls. So I don't know what's the answer really. Pigeons now become feral. They are many, I think the number is there in my book, some million something. And again, it's our custom that, we feed, it's an Indian culture that we feed all of these animals around us. And then the population grows, and then at some point, it's like, now we need to kind of control them. But yeah, maybe let it be, we'll have to just see, let them be, and then, maybe nature will take care of it.
All right. I'll stop here for a while and let people in the room ask questions. Can I have the volunteers please help pass the mic?
There's a switch.
Am I audible? Sorry. So the line we are playing God with species around us, etc. So thinking on those lines, my question is: are we also playing God with human species? Are we interfering in human life, passing interpretations, judgment, transportation, migration, and taking people across and thinking we know enough about our own lives to make decisions on them? As a species, have we biologically collected enough information, and have we interpreted the limited information that we have in the right manner to come to a proper conclusion about do we think what a conclusion about do we know what is best for us?
So, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but as a journalist and having written about it, written about environment, at least, from the aspect of environment, I can say that, no, I don't think we understand, really what we are doing to other humans as well. There's a lot of talk about, marginalized people and, how climate change is affecting them more than, people who are more elite and people living in the cities. And there is not much discussion, there's no policy talk about, people who are on the margins. And it's always, everything is always looked at as from the economy point of view and the development point of view. There is really not much, I think, discussion from as a human species, what is good for us, right? I mean, we are part of this environment, we are part of this planet, and that connect sometimes is not really taken into consideration. I think that's all I can say.
Yeah, so I'd just like to add to that. I think this is a very interesting question because often when you are, for example, when we are talking about, like right now, the Aravalli debate, the entire focus of the discussion, of course, one is the environment, but the other side is basically looking at the money, right? So it's always even in the previous session we were hearing about how new parliamentary act is coming into play, which is going to, give indemnity to the businessmen and the companies. So unfortunately, it has become this capitalistic view of everything. You're not really thinking about, how it's affecting the lives of people, not just on the fringes, but also the people who don't have the resources to afford a certain lifestyle. Yesterday when I was coming, Ravi was with me, Ravi Chellam, and he said something which struck me. He said, all of these, we were talking about the concrete jungle that we were driving through, and he said, yeah, all of that is real estate, as if whatever existed before that was false. I think that sums it up brilliantly.
And if I may just add to that, right, since we are talking about pests, this was a thought that just came to me that we humans are, look at our population, right? How much our population has grown over the years and how much we are extracting from the planet Earth and, from the destruction that we are causing to the planet Earth and the environment. And maybe if somebody asks planet Earth, like, who are the pests,
Yeah,
right?
we are
She
the
might
biggest
say
pests.
that, yeah, humans are the biggest pests on this Earth.
Good afternoon. Professor Bhadra, your view that let them be, specifically for dogs, since you work on dogs, isn't it too extreme? Because we live in a city where dogs will get food, they will multiply, and so intervention, you are saying, is not required. It's kind of utopian, it seems like.
Okay.
Because, may I finish? Okay, because on the other hand, there is a Supreme Court order which is extremely interventionist. I don't know why it's not being discussed, maybe it's too dangerous or whatever, but that's another unrealistic proposition, right? And where do we find a middle path between these two, this utopian view of let them be and just destroy them and put them somewhere where we don't need to see them, specifically for dogs?
Yeah. So when I said let them be, I was responding specifically to Deepa's question of how to interact with dogs. Of course, there would be many places where there is an overpopulation. And there are typical given guidelines how to handle overpopulation, and that's the law of the country. I'm not going beyond that. My point of letting them be is more like a long-term, idealistic, as you might say, utopian perspective from the perspective of an ecologist who, because I have seen, for example, where I live in a small town where there are a lot of people who are feeding dogs and taking care of them, a lot of dog lovers. And I'm seeing now, in this last 15 years, I have seen the dog population suddenly grow, which is a problem because all of these issues are coming in. So when you have a problem, you have to find a solution to it, put aggressive dogs in shelters, etc., etc. But if we did not have a problem, let us not create a problem by overfeeding, overt caring, where if you, my point is if you really want to take care of a dog, take it home, adopt it, keep it as a pet. As a community, they can exist, let them be. So I'm not really talking about the problem statement, but I'm talking about the coexistent perspective of how you can coexist with dogs without doing either too much, showing either too much love or too much hate. Supreme Court, the hearing is still on actually. The original directive has been put on hold, and every week there is a hearing and we still don't have a solution. Another hearing coming up next week. And I can tell you from a different perspective, because I work as a consultant member of the community with our local municipality, and they got a direction from the government, from the central government to all the municipalities, saying that you have to notify all schools and colleges to remove all the dogs from their campus and put dogs in shelters. So they said, we don't have funds. You know, we don't have a shelter. And in fact, we have been trying to do a vaccination and partial neutering drive, but they don't have a space where they can put the dogs for the neutering. So, you know, it's very easy to say it on paper. But then they said, the amount of money we need, we don't have even, you know, one rupee. We don't have the space. We just have a directive. How do you work? So there are a lot of problems even when you have a directive or an order. And then there is the law, the Animal Rights Act. So all of that has to be taken care of. That's a long run thing, and policy makers somehow don't listen to scientists. That is another problem. But if I was talking to a person and, you know, community of people and looking at a community of dogs where there is no problem, but they're asking me how to manage them, I would say let them be. These are very two different perspectives I'm coming from.
She has been raising hand for a while.
Sorry, this is building on to the gentleman's question, and it is breaching human behavior as well. But I wanted to ask how this ideology of the Supreme Court, if we don't want to contradict the law of the land, which hasn't yet come, how is it impacting the sensitivity that we have as human beings and how we interact with different species? This question goes out to both of you, because I have observed as a spectator, we've seen that desensitization is being propagated a lot because we treat them as pests. If we have created the issue ourselves as human beings, now we are treating them as pests and we are playing God. It's all a vicious cycle. Yes. And how do you think that this, firstly, ruling is impacting people's behavior and decision? And how do you think that we proceed further? Thinking the worst, that this is actually going to impact a lot of species and is going to give people the right to behave the way that they are. How do we proceed?
And if you may allow me, I will also add one more layer of complexity to it. So for a long time, I used to also think just from this lens. And when the Supreme Court conversation started, I came across conversations on how rabies is still prevalent. And it is a glaring truth also, if we look at it, that how many people get infected by rabies due to dog bite. So people's fear against dogs is a legit fear. So yes.
Firstly, I would say that fear, you can actually, we are sitting in Hyderabad where 500 plus dogs have been killed after this started over a very short span of time, followed by now monkeys. In the same way. So firstly, it's not going to stop at dogs. It's going to propagate to other species, and people would feel that they have the right to do this because, court said so. Second problem is we don't have the money or the resources to actually put all dogs in shelters, even if we wanted to, period. Third issue is that there are a lot of people who genuinely care for these animals, and are we okay to hurt everybody's feelings? You look at all the protests which have been organized all over the country. Fourth, and I think it's very important, what are we teaching our children? Where is the empathy? And we keep talking about Indian knowledge system, our culture, our history, everything, which I think today morning we heard about compassion. Our culture is compassion, of coexistence, of empathy. If we forget that and we say, no, we don't want Western science, but we don't want our own original culture or our own original practices to remain, where are we going? That's one thing. The other point is, if this has to be taken through, we have to remember, again, as I said, dogs don't exist in isolation. There have been cases where people have culled dogs and then they had issues with rodents. In fact, the Gujarat plague is one example which we had in our own country. So we have to keep in mind that, one species you target, you don't know what dominoes effect you are going to have, and you cannot just do this one thing and think that I've solved all our problems. You're probably going to create more problems, just like with the sparrows. So it's not an easy way out. And for me as an ecologist, thinking that you can remove any species just because you think it's a pest, even if it is a pest, is not okay. So you can control a population, you cannot eliminate a population, because again, it's all connected, it's all a network, and moving one node from the network is going to impact the whole network in some way or the other.
Deepa, would you like to add?
Yeah. So I'll give the example of wildlife-human conflict because that is something I have written on and reported. I have gone and spoken to the villagers living who have experienced conflict. So the statistics say that deaths caused by elephants annually, there are about 500 people killed by elephants. Now, if you apply this logic, then we would say that no, we have to gather all the elephants and put them in a zoo, but that would be ridiculous. And if you go and talk to the people who live on these outskirts of the forest, they are actually, they have a lot of tolerance towards these conflicts. They suffer almost on an everyday basis. Yes, there is occasional retribution, some tiger is poisoned or some monkeys are killed, but mostly they are quite tolerant. And because wildlife conservation has succeeded, that their population has increased, but on the other hand, their habitats have reduced because, we humans have been encroaching on their habitats. One thing, a policy that helped was, sorry, I'm blanking out on the word, but it's, no, not corridors, it is compensation. So for every loss that they face, and there are different categories of loss, whether it is loss of property, loss of cattle, and human life, there is compensation that is given, and that to a large extent has helped to at least reduce the tensions between the people who are living there. So something on those lines I feel would be more appropriate rather than some very drastic thing like, put them on shelters, which is, I don't think it is a very
So
relevant.
touching upon the rabies issue, yes, rabies is a fact. We have to remember dogs are the not only carriers of rabies. All other animals can cause rabies. Secondly, we have to understand that current data shows that the reports of dog bites and rabies are actually quite inflated. Firstly, they are extrapolations, they are not actual counts. And a recent set of RTIs actually revealed that the reports which were given on dog bites comes from not actual counting of dog bites, but actual counting of anti-rabies vaccines. And it revealed that they are counting the number of injections being sold, which means for every bite, you count it as 5, because there are 5 injections per bite. And every bite is attributed to a stray dog, whereas we know from data from other countries that more often people are bitten by their own pets, while playing, by accidentally, than by a dog outside. And in India, while we have spoken to people, they often just blame it on a dog outside because there is this, you don't want to blame your own pet. So there is a lot of lack of true data. We really don't know what the burden of rabies is in our country, and we definitely don't know what the burden of rabies is from dogs on streets. So there is a problem there itself. The other problem is when somehow we have accepted in the urban habitat that dogs don't belong on streets, they belong in people's drawing rooms. Whereas, if you talk to people in villages, we have done this. There was a case in a nearby village where a dog had actually killed somebody's goat. And a goat is a very prized possession because some 4,000-5,000 rupees. And we were speaking to him, and he said, okay, this is one of the dogs in the pack which killed my goat. And this dog was lying in his courtyard. So we said, no, you're okay with it, it's here. He said, yeah, he lives here. Only, sometimes these outside rogue dogs come and then they form a pack and they go around hunting. And when, I don't know what happens. Basically, we figured it was happening in the mating season. But then we said, but then you're still tolerating this dog. In Bangla, what he said is, he's also human. He also has to survive. Must have been very hungry when it killed my goat. I cannot just throw it away. He's lived with me all its life. That is the level of tolerance that people can have, which is the other extreme, right?
Absolutely. Are there other burning questions? Okay, we'll take one last question and then other questions can go off. Okay, 2 more questions, you, and then we close.
So my question is to Professor Bhadra. What actually drives a dog to attack a human? Because I've tried to pet so many dogs which are even growling at me, quite foolishly I admit, but even then I've never been bitten, so it is hard for me to understand that dogs actually go and attack humans.
Yeah, actually in all our 16 years of data collection, not a single student has ever been attacked. That speaks a lot about dogs, right? But often
How many dogs are we talking about here?
Thousands. So, but what we have seen is when we hear a report, this dog has bitten people, most often it is stupid human behavior. I can give you one particular case on our campus where a female dog was biting people, 3 bites, and then we found she had given birth in a ditch next to the road. The first bite was, it was almost dusk, and a lady passing by saw the puppies. She went in to take photos of the puppies, and the mother came and bit her. The second case, some guy was bitten by mosquitoes, and he was standing there, and he was stamping his feet next to the den, and the mother came and bit him on his ankle. The third case was when somebody was passing by, and this mother happened to come, and he tried to shoo away the mother. And the mother just ran and bit this person. So we have seen this number of times that sometimes, especially when they are first-time mothers, or if they have just lost a litter in the previous round, then they become overprotective and sometimes they bite. Sometimes dogs which are actually suffering from some health issues, they get, we are ill, we also get irritable, more irritable. They are sometimes prone to biting. So if there is a case, mostly it's like they will go around biting people in a series, and those dogs really need to be taken care of.
And sometimes I think dogs are also a little bit territorial, right? Like when I
Not
walk
little
my
bit,
pet
extremely.
dog, there is another
Extremely.
dog that, you know, when I go
See,
alone,
dogs,
he's totally fine. But
dogs
when I take my
became-
pet dog,
dogs
it's like,
became adopted by humans historically because they are territorial. They would guard the dens, right? One of the big things, reasons why people like dogs.
Good evening. I have been I won't tell pet mom or something. I had dogs and cats both in my house. So I have petted both. So I was a cat person before, but after having both in my house, I have become a dog person. Please don't get offended. If we say that dogs are very loyal, and according to my point of view, cats are bit bossy. I'll tell you why. If I feed my dog, he would be very loyal to me. He would be jumping around all of a sudden. But for my cat, it is not that way. She wants the food, that's it.
Yeah, they are very
हो गया
independent.
उसका. So I'm asking because you guys are experts. What is your take on cats? Actually, I can be wrong on my perspective
See,
of being
cats
bossy.
are by definition solitary animals. So the behavior you expect from a solitary animal is very different from a behavior which is a social animal. And dogs are by nature social. So social animals show more bonding with even members of their own species, and for dogs that has somehow translated to humans also. But cats in general don't even bond with their kittens for long, right? Once they wean, they leave the kittens and go away. So that is the cat's nature. You cannot change that.
Okay, I will now, I've gotten enough signals from the room that I should close the session, but I think I will really try to remind myself and all of you, if you might want this reminder, that we are essentially in a very complex ecosystem where every living thing is connected to each other, not just in terms of how we materially benefit from each other, but like how one of our friends here reminded that when we kill these animals, what does it do to us as a human? So we are really living with them. And maybe just this humanness is what we will benefit remembering from. So with that, I'll close the session, and thank you both, Deepa.
and if I may just put in a plug for my book is available at the bookstore, and I would encourage you all to buy it. Thank you.